Good afternoon, everybody. It's Dr. Spinda again here from Wilson Hall. I wanted to come in and talk a little bit about Chapter 3. Now, I realize I've split it up over 2 weeks, with this being a shortened week coming up here with Labor Day. There's kind of a lot that I wanted to go over in Chapter 3, and I want you to kind of look at. So that is exactly why I have it going over 2 weeks. And also, it kind of gives you a time to prepare for what's coming up, which I'll talk about in my other video announcement. But regarding Chapter 3, like I said, I have it split up over 2 weeks, but I'd like to kind of cover it all within one video. So you'll have a video for this week, and it'll also be the same video for next week. I think it'd just be a lot easier instead of trying to split the chapter up with my video notes, if you will. You'll have kind of a beginning and end as you go through. So to kind of look it over, the chapter really begins talking about stage models of conflict, which I think is an interesting discussion, because in our world, what we try to do a lot of times is make sense of the world. We stereotype, and we use that word a lot of times in a negative way. You know, you're stereotyping races or genders or orientations of religion, things like that. But we also use that word to kind of explain what we try to do in making sense of the world. We try to make sense of conflict. How do we do that? We put it into stages, right? There's a beginning, middle, and end. Well, that's kind of true when it comes to conflict, but at the same time, it's also a little bit more dynamic than that. And I think the book treats it really well by going over a couple different models of how stages are used in conflict. But I think a particular interest for you as the reader would be kind of looking at how page 77 has 4 different insights that stage models give us, and kind of some limitations as to what they do. They help make sense of things, but then again, like I had mentioned, conflict's a little bit more dynamic than stages. So that's a good part of the reading. The second part I wanted you to kind of take a look at is interdependence and climate, and especially the idea of climate on page 80. I kind of almost feel like the text should maybe make a little bit bigger of a deal about climate. Thinking about the climate or the environment in which conflict occurs in is really an important thing, and you'll see a lot of that details on page 80 there. And also, I think a term that kind of is not trumpeted enough in the text is the idea of perceived interdependence on page 81. You'll see that there, versus kind of actual interdependence. And kind of that discussion, I feel, is really an interesting one. Okay, kind of moving into the last part of the first week of reading here. The one sidebar talks about the tit-for-tat strategy. And in the past, I've used this before as a really interesting way to talk about conflict. A lot of people look at it as, you know, tit-for-tat, eye for an eye, whatever you want to call it. It's really a negative strategy. And for the most part, you could probably categorize it as such. But there's been some interesting research that's talked about how people have used that strategy successfully, especially when it comes to kind of hard to deal with parties, which is something I know we all have an interest with in conflict. So with that being said, the last part we want to look at going into Chapter 3, the last 2 things actually, were conflict frames and reframing. This idea that we put conflict into different frames, kind of how we look, the way we look at it and the way we consider conflict. Is a very important thing. We use frames, again, to make sense of conflict, kind of an overarching theme of Chapter 3. This is subconsciously done, and I think the book provides some really good examples on page 89 and 90 of different framing and reframing strategies we tend to use. And again, to kind of finish up the Chapter 3, there's a long discussion about intergroup conflict, which I'm sure a lot of us are kind of aware of, easily described as that kind of us versus them or we versus they kind of conflict. And as we know, that tends to be strong conflict, a lot of times much more stronger than individual conflict. So that's an interesting reading. I think it is kind of ended well with Exhibit 3.4 on page 98 and 99. It talks about kind of how we use this we-they framing and kind of how we can avoid those kinds of pitfalls in the future. So with that being said, there's a lot of reading in Chapter 3, a lot of really good material, and that is, again, why I spread it out over 2 weeks. So good luck with it, and any questions, let me know. Thank you.